so I don't feel so ministerial. I want to discuss three terms tonight. Three words in the English language. The word affect, A-F-F-E-C-T, the word singularity, and the word aggregation. I want to do so in the context of what I call the paradigm shift that has taken place between, let's say, the mechanical paradigm and the electronic paradigm. And I would like to put forward the idea that architecture was and has been the sine qua non exemplar of the mechanical paradigm. That is, it based on the withstanding of mechanical forces by mechanical means, that is, or natural forces by mechanical means. The idea of gravity, of structure, of shelter, all are the foundation elements of our vocabulary, both philosophic vocabulary and our vocabulary dealing with the environment. All comes from an architecture that withstood gravity, and therefore was exemplary of what I call the mechanical paradigm. Now, Vitruvius, when he talked about firmitas, that is firmness, the structural capacity of architecture, was not talking so much about the fact that architecture had to stand up, because clearly it was known that architecture had to stand up, but rather that architecture had to symbolize this standing up, that it had to make apparent in some form or another that it was doing its standing up function. And again, that was what architecture was about. It had to look like it was standing up. Now, traditionally, architecture not only symbolized its role as a foundation stone in the mechanical paradigm, but also it was a traditionally what I call strong media. That is, in the Gothic era, before the printing press, architecture was media to all of the people that could not read the liturgy, could perhaps not understand Latin. But the vessel of the cathedral, in fact, expressed the relationship of God to man very clearly and in a way that made architecture very strong media. I think not just because of the invention of the printing press did architecture begin to lose its role as strong media, but in fact, as the change in what architecture was doing, as architecture became what I call more effective, it became less affective. That is, the more it had to solve functions and to deal with the manifestation of those functional solutions, the less it took care of its symbolic and tactile and sensual domain. So thus, in the 18th and 19th century, with the development of social functions such as hospitals, schools, factories, prisons, even public housing, that is mass functions, the more these mass functions took over and were more to do with repetition, standardization, the less architecture had to do with its manifestation as the overcoming of mechanical forces, and more it became an effective means to solve these social functions. And as I say, the more it became effective, the less affective it became, and the less strong media. Now, we switch, jump cut, to the middle, late 20th century, and we have a true strong media. There is no question that television, film, but especially television, and to a lesser degree film and photography, have taken over the tactile functions that architecture used to hold. And with it, because of the fact that the notion of time has changed, we now have the narrative time that formerly accrued to an architecture. That is, you would walk into a building, you would understand through a series of apperceptions what a building was about, is no longer a condition that people really understand. They do not know how to apperceive space. They have lost their capacity to physically understand architecture. That is because they become so adjusted to media. Last night, I watched the England international match on television, and when David Platt scored his first goal, we saw it 5 times. And of course, when David Platt scored his second goal, there was this, even the TV commentators couldn't tell whether the ball was in the net or out of the net, right? And they had to wait until all angles of the replay were in before saying, well, I guess it must have been a goal, Trevor. And Trevor said, yes, jolly good. And a goal it was. Now, even Trevor had lost his capacity to see whether the goal was in or out. And really, what you now have in U.S. arenas is something even more devastating than instant replay to take away from the experience of reality. We now have giant TV screens, so that if you go, as I did recently, I'm doing a building in Atlanta, Georgia, when there is what we call a rain delay and those stadiums that don't have roofs, you are able to watch giant screen television, and you're able to watch another baseball game from some other place, or another basketball game, since the seasons no longer make any difference. They weave together. And what's interesting is when they finally begin to play, we have in America a custom of singing the Star-Spangled Banner, which is our national anthem. And I'm now getting an echo in this thing, so I will put it down. In any case, what's interesting, they don't have an actual flag in the Atlanta Stadium any longer. They have a TV replica of the flag, a giant TV replica of the flag. And what's so interesting about the TV, it's surrounded by a sign which says Sony. So that we're getting actually the American flag presented by Sony Corporation, which we're standing up and looking and saluting this emblem, which I think is great, because I think some kids will begin to think, Jasper Johns used to paint flags on canvases. I believe a new Jasper Johns would paint the flag on a canvas with a Sony label around it. This would be, the next invocation of reality. Now, what's so interesting about these giant TV screens, and I was taken through the Toronto Dome this weekend, and the screen is enormous. And what the people said is that the people come, these stadiums are sold out, the people come to the stadium to come and see the giant TV screen. And because the game is shown now live on the screen. And what's so interesting about being in such a stadium is that you really don't watch the play on the field, because it's difficult with this damn giant TV screen, and it's with the new Japanese technology, the clarity of things, and you get the instant replay with, you don't have to keep turning back and forth as if you were at a tennis match. You can just watch the screen. So what people do now is they come and watch the screen. Now, what that has done to this reality factor of understanding space is that people used to get up between innings. They have innings in American games for the commercials to take place. They used to get their hot dogs and their popcorn and things like that between innings. But because the commercials are so much better than the game itself, the people make sure that they're in the seats for the commercials and get up during the game, because actually, you've seen the game before. Now, I have to tell you about the efficacy of television on little children. I have a 21-month-old, 22 months yesterday, son, who we prop up for experimental purposes. Since what the hell am I going to do with a 22-year-old son but use him for some, future lectures? We prop him up in front of a TV set to watch Sesame Street. And I'm learning now about all the relearning all the Sesame Street characters, a la peanut butter sandwiches, and I can do that sort of thing. I know all of the Thomas the Tank Engines. I can give you the numbers of, more than most of you can do if I gave you a quiz of things that are important. If you could know that James was in the red engine was number 6, and these are really important things you've got to know, because when your son wants the red engine and he says 6, you got to know which one it is that he wants. But in any case, propping this little 22-month-old fellow in front of the TV set, he doesn't really care about Sesame Street, because he doesn't talk, but he takes in sound and image. But the minute Sesame Street switches to its commercials, his head snaps up. And he is absolutely riveted to the commercial, even though he doesn't know he's getting a commercial message, doesn't know the difference. What he does realize, that the density of sound and light, because that's what these guys know how to do, they don't make things louder, they make things more dense, is in fact what is bombarding his sensibility. So that, in fact, he is having his spatiality and his capacity to understand narration taken away for this density of sound and light that is bombing him with commercial messages. So that for him, he begins to find indistinguishable what is a commercial and what isn't, and especially when you're watching things like the Olympics and you get these Reebok ads which begin to show you simulated events. You never know when you're turning in, especially if you're turning in Eurosport, which is playing back things 24 hours a day, whether you're watching a commercial, a replay, something that happened 4 years ago, one never knows anymore. And it doesn't matter, because it's all been so homogenized. We don't realize the enormous impact of TV on our sense of reality, and our sense of spatial reality and time reality, because architecture was the sine qua non of this space-time reality. Two other examples, I think, that are important in this context. One is, I was at a middle-class American suburban wedding last year, and where there are rituals for what a wedding is. You recognize a wedding because a bride wears white. There is a father whose arm she comes down on the aisle on. The groom comes out with the best man. The wedding march from Lohengrin is played. There are all of these kinds of things which you all in Britain are not encumbered with, probably. But in any case, they still remain some vestiges of this kind of reality in America. And we all stood up as the wedding march began, and the bride came down the aisle. About a third of the way, when suddenly there was, cut, listen, could you go back, please? I'd like the father a little more. Could you come around a little more to the front? We've lost you. The light isn't quite right. I need to get you focused in here. And could you smile a little bit more? Could you be a little happier? Because, and we did that 3 times, right? And then we got to the altar, and then we had to do ring putting on, each one 2 or 3 times, get the light right. Could you try and make that a little more as if you had some feeling about it? Now, how can you have any feeling the 3rd time around, right? All of the anxiety of what you were trying to do is totally lost. You kiss the bride 2 or 3 times. They actually cut the cake and put it back together so it could be recut. Now, what am I saying? I'm saying is that the only reality, or what we used to think of reality, of this event, the only place you could see it was in the TV tape that they were going to put together for the couple to record the wedding that never was. Because there was never this wedding that you're going to see on the tape. It's only something that's put together to appear like the former weddings used to be, right? To make it look like a wedding. And these people have a tape that shows a wedding that never happened. That is, one that was uninterrupted by these retakes. They have the perfect wedding. Now, if these kinds of things can happen, that TV takes over from reality, it's very difficult. Do these people think that that was their wedding? Yes, they do. They have their wedding on tape. There was a beauty contest. I was absolutely amazed by this. There was a beauty contest that was held on television. But in order to make sure there would be no glitches, even though the results were not known, it had to be pre-taped. And so what they did for this was to take the four finalists, and take the four finalists, having the envelope open and say, and the winner is Joanne from Kentucky. And Joanne runs up and grabs the bouquet of flowers and kisses the master of ceremonies and says how happy I am to have won, right? Finish with Joanne, right? Then comes, the envelope is opened again, and the winner is Sharon from Virginia, right? And Sharon runs out and does the same thing. These poor people, where these things really mean a lot to them, had to simulate the joy and excitement of winning something which they won't know until they see it on TV whether they really won or lost. Right? Now, the terror of all of this comes when it gets even out of hand. Recently, there was a 10-year-old girl that was kidnapped from a shopping mall in the United States. The police felt there was something very strange about this kidnapping, but they really couldn't put their finger on it, and they couldn't find the girl, and there were no reasons for her having been kidnapped, etc. And about 3 weeks later, in a tale of horror, they found the girl buried in a cave beneath her babysitter's house. In other words, the person, her guardian, who was supposedly looking after this girl, had built a cage beneath his house and for imprisoning people, and had kept her there with food and water, alive, with a TV camera so she could see the police coming into the house. I mean, it's one of those, and she could scream, but of course no one could hear her. And of course the police couldn't take him away because they felt something like this was happening. And that they incarcerated him, she was dead. I mean, this terrible double bind of this thing. But what's coming out now is that he might have been paid by her parents to kidnap her so that they could then make a film of this kidnapping for television and get the money for the film because they were quite destitute. Now, this is life imitating horror of an enormous situation. And of course, as you remember recently, there was the filming of a man actually shooting his wife on American TV. Now, you say, this is horrible, why don't we stop it? Try. How are you going to stop? Turn off your TV sets, shoot the TV producers, kill the media? And I think, as I was saying to a gentleman today from the media, that media has in fact turned architecture into what it is. I mean, I am here because I happen to be mediatable, not necessarily because I do interesting architecture or good architecture. And if you merely do what you do ordinarily, the media chews you up and spits you out, and need something new all the time. So it's not like you can sustain a career or develop a career, because the career that you sustain and develop is totally dependent on, in fact, on media, as I will show you in my first project tonight. So what I'm saying is that we have, in architecture, are faced with an enormous problem. And that is that people not only no longer have a sense of real time, but have lost the sense of real place. For example, I lectured last fall in the Teatro Olimpico in Vicenza, Palladios Teatro Olimpico. I had never had lectured from the stage before. I'd never been on the stage. To be on the stage at the Teatro Olimpico was a kind of magic for me. And I thought, oh my God, this is going to be fantastic. And just to hear my voice and what the sound of my voice would be like in this space, and to be in the space, was quite supposedly was going to be an extraordinary event. And as I began to lecture, everybody in the audience put on earphones. Because clearly the affect of this presentation was totally unimportant to them. The actual event itself. What was really important was the possibility of, there's a seat up here if you want one. There is a seat. You can enjoy it. The notion that they were more interested in hearing what I had to say than being at this occasion was an incredible thing for me. And I asked them, I said, you know, what would be really interesting is if you would take your earphones off and just listen to the voice and the space and be in the space rather than trying to understand what I have to say. And of course, this was very difficult. You couldn't get them to be, as it were, unmediated. We are designing a music hall in Atlanta, Georgia. And what I have said to the clients is this. You know, they said, we want to hear the best sound we can hear. We've got to get the best acousticians. We've got to get the best theater consultants, people that know a lot about amplification of sound and light and the proper seating and everything. And I said, hey, wait a minute. I said, people who want to hear music are going to hear it better on laser discs with their earphones. They walk around all day long like this anyway. Most of the people are so deadened to their physical environment that, in fact, all they can do is hear beautiful music. I said, what makes you think that anybody wants to hear music in a live music hall? Because they can't hear it as well. If you really want to hear Mahler's Fourth, you're not going to hear it anywhere but on a laser disc. And I said, look, why don't we make the event of going to hear music something different than hearing well, right? Why don't we hear not well for a change, right? Wouldn't that be an event? Why can't we go and have an event where the music is problematized by the space, right? And they were problematized. Problematize the music? And of course, that's, you know, the thought that that might be a possibility, that we could confound the aesthetics, you know, with the experience of being in the hall. That the being in the hall, hearing a difficult sound experience rather than a clear sound experience was not on. And of course, I have been working hard to convince them that that's what they should do. One final note about what's on and what's not on before I show you some slides which have nothing to do with any of what I'm talking about. I believe that one is attempting to reframe, recast the possibility of the individual in space having an experience from architecture. That is, to try and restore architecture to something of its former condition, not by doing classical architecture and saying, oh, that's what means the form. No, by making the possibility of it becoming affective again. And I did a convention center in Columbus, Ohio, which you will see some of the early shots from this. It's just finishing up. And in the interior of the rooms, we wanted the people to have a physical experience. So we twisted the walls and tilted the moldings and something like this, just slightly, right? And in the first test runs of people coming into this space, it seemed to work very well. People were reporting to the convention center authorities that they were experiencing vertigo, that they were experiencing airsickness. 2 people actually vomited on the carpet. The convention center authorities got very upset by this. And I said, well, you know, this won't happen all the time. Don't forget, people get used to these things, but at least they will have been refrained in their sense of physicality. They will really initially feel something. I mean, nobody gets airsick anymore. Yet I remember throwing up often in airplanes. They still have those airsick bags. It was the whole psychological dislocation of flying that caused one to be upset. And the airsick bag comes from a time when in 1945, when you flew, you were going to get airsick because everybody got airsick, right? And you held onto your bag waiting to be airsick. You know, I remember I used to fly like this, you know, desperately hoping I could get it over with, right? So that you know, how many times could you get sick in this airsick bag, or would I make it into the bag? You know, can I get it out in time so I'd hold it? And I said, you know, we could provide these people with airsick bags if they want in this convention center, just in case, you know, this is a problem. No, we had to redo all of the interior rooms. We had to straighten everything out, right? Now, that shows you that the world is still not ready for what I call an affective architecture. That is, because they have become so deadened to the possibility of space that a little thing like a disorienting thing gets people airsick and with vertigo. I hadn't expected such a response. I must say, in all honesty, when I walked into the ballroom the other day, and I do know more or less my own design, I really felt like the floor was tipping. It was the most amazing experience. And I did, even though I knew this thing, was prepared for it, it was an incredible sensation that suddenly I thought, oh my God, this thing does move. It literally is moving. And of course, I know it doesn't move. But of course, neither did the architecture of the Baroque, and people felt that the Baroque was moving. So that I believe that we need to talk about the question of affect and to restore architecture to its condition of physical presence or presentness. The second term that I think is very important is this question of singularity. And I could discourse, and I would like to take these subjects up in the seminars that I'm going to give in the fall here. But certainly the question of singularity deals with the issue of the difference between individuality and singularity. And for Walter Benjamin, in the mechanical paradigm, the discourse, the dialectic between the multiple and the individual, the group and the individual, the mass and the individual was very important. What was the nature of individual in the age of mechanical reproduction? And of course we got into replication and the difference between self-sameness and self-similarity and all of these kinds of things which began to distinguish what was the individual. And of course then there was the role of what was the individual author in the era of mechanical reproduction, and what was the value that the individual brought to, let's say, a photograph. And it was clear that the individual still could mediate the photograph. In other words, the individual could make a photograph lighter, darker, grainier, larger, smaller. All kinds of things could be done with the photograph that involved the individual. And so the authorship, the notion of authority was, in fact, very important. But with electronic media, with the fax machine, the individual, even the signing process, is lost because no longer does one send the original, because the original confuses the reception of the electronic original. And that, in other words, I write a letter, I sign it, I send it through fax, and I put the original in my file. It never goes away any longer. And the person no longer receives an original, and that electronic original is not mediated by me in any case at all. I have no way of modulating its reception and what can be done to it. In other words, I have only a way, let's say, of interfering with it by printing it on different color paper so that it can no longer be faxed or even Xeroxed. In other words, there are ways of interrupting the discourse of electronic media. I believe that what we need to do is to project, let's say, or ask ourselves, is there an alternative to the notion of individuality in a mass society which is no longer a society in the age of mechanical reproduction? And I say, yes, there is this possibility, and this possibility is called singularity, where singularity has nothing to do with the qualities of individuality. It has nothing to do with the ego. It has nothing to do with the hand of the author. It has nothing to do with many of the conditions that formally defined the condition of individuality. But in fact, demarks a whole other area of uniqueness that is outside of individuality. And that area of uniqueness is the difference between the objecthood, the formal characteristics of something and how it is made, and that is the thingness of being and the thisness of being. And it is the thisness of being, the naming of this, that I would argue is singularity. And we could talk about Marcel Proust. I mean, I could tell you, give you how Proust condenses the notion of singularity as opposed to the individual, and talks about the first time that the young Proust meets the woman on Swann's Way, and how the fact of his naming of her creates her in time and in place of a thisness which forever conditions the walk on Swann's Way. And the singularity of that time event becomes part of all the time events of the walking on Swann's Way. But again, this condition of singularity has an enormous set of implications about design and how we must deal with the possibility of design. And I said I will just introduce it here tonight, save it for the week that I come in the fall as one of the issues that I really want to talk about in some detail. The last subject tonight is the subject of aggregation. And this introduces the whole question of the difference between composition and organization. Now, Gilles Deleuze, in an essay, very clearly says that for him, composition is something from within, an internal organizing element, and organization is something from without. Now, clearly in architecture, since composition is a loaded word and always means something from above and without, I choose to use the terms differently. And I say that composition is the tradition of the Beaux-Arts and the classical architect designer from without, and aggregation, which see organization. Aggregation is that which comes from within. And of course, what we begin to understand is that when we look at the new conditions of science and thought. When we look at complexity as put forward by the Santa Fe Institute, and we look at the condition of ideas that are coming in the new economics, the new biology, where we are talking about chaos theory and the orders of chance and the arbitrary and the formal qualities of slime moles and the spots of leopards and things like this, we begin to realize that there are whole sets of formal conditions that our classical brain cannot deal with, because these things that we know to be design are always imposed on this matter from without, from above, as positivities. And what we understand of these other self-organizing systems, these other complexities, come from within, our interiorities that are possible to make apparent in architecture. The final notion that why these things, I think, are important for us today, other than the fact that we are trying to confront media, is that we now have a profession and a student body of people made up of 50% women. And they are trying to understand how to be architects. And of course, this is a very difficult proposition. Why is it a difficult proposition? Because architecture is first and foremost, in the mechanical era, phallocentric, and secondly, logocentric. And therefore, two conditions of being which are, in a sense, against the feminine. That is, against what is the psychophysiological condition of the woman. Now, how a woman can practice phallocentrism or logocentrism, that is to design a hierarchical tall building, is beyond me, right? Only by turning herself into a male psyche. Now, the difference between the male psyche and the female psyche, I would argue, is that the male psyche is a sun psyche. It is either on brightly or it's off. Right? Is no in between. The male ego architect, witnessing one standing in front of you in all its full-blown narcissism, shines only brightly. Right? It doesn't shine partially. It doesn't shine in phases. It has trouble being turned off. It only goes 150%. And therefore, traditionally, architecture, in its phallogocentrism, was also a sun discipline. In other words, it responded to this kind of discourse, and it was a compositional energy coming from above onto something projected down on, forming presence rather than this way, from within, like this, opening up, coral-like, from within. And I maintain that the feminine psyche and ego is a moon psyche. It is in phases and stages. It sometimes shines in the day without having its attention called to it. It sometimes does not need to burn brightly. And so when you say, when a male ego says, oh my God, I feel so sorry for that woman, don't. Because women don't have the same psychic ego conditions that men do. They don't need to be shining brightly all the time. Their shining is something very, very different. However, to suggest that the moon psyche should come into a sun profession and leave it unchanged is a mistake. And so I think the most important thing about this architecture in the age of electronic media is that we need to change architecture from a sun discourse to at least one that is 50-50 sun and moon discourse. That comes from within, from aggregation, from singularity, and from affect, as opposed to effect, individual, and composition. And my argument is not that we will do away with these sun disciplines, but that we must add to them these moon discourses. Now, I'm going to show you a series of projects that a sun boy, as I said today, Captain Geometry, Mr. Logo Man, is trying to do under a moon discourse. And people say, you know, we liked Eisenman back in those old days. Well, who are those people that sang those things? You know, we like those early houses. You know, those are sun boys. You know, and if you watch who does the talking, you know, where are the women critics that saying that they like those sun projects? You know, and I believe that we need to begin to really understand what it means to have women side by side in our studios, in our offices, on the savannah. What it means to have female gorillas running loose, you know, and saying, oh no, well those are just chimpanzees or spider monkeys. We don't have to take care of that. But you know, there are female gorillas. You know, I see one in the front row tonight. I am convinced that not more than 10 years from now, we will have more such gorillas rather than less, because of the way things are going. I merely want to show you tonight one struggle with the issue of struggle. I'm not suggesting that there are answers. I'm going to show you the manifestations of that struggle in the work. I don't believe it's important for any of you to see them as guidelines, as ways to the future, but as, let's say, the writing on the wall. After I show the slides, I want to talk briefly about writing in a concluding moment, and then we can take questions. So can we get some of the lights and have the slides? Do I have I asked for yeah, I did. A stick. This is an important slide. First of all, it tells you something about media, and it will tell you something about the change in the need of mechanical objects to express their mechanical possibilities. I need to take this with me.
You don't need to.
Oh, okay. Okay, I won't touch it. I want you to notice some terrible hidden agendas here. One, the New York Times is now not in the largest letters here, but business, right? And this picture is on the business page of the New York Times. And then we have a slogan which contains a very sly reference to a very nasty bit of male locker room talk about women, which I'm amazed that appears in the New York Times, you know, in a headline. Of course, the women ask me, what is he talking about, you know, but you haven't been in a locker room recently with all men. In any case, again, that's not the important thing, but just to show you that some people don't really care about the moon. We have this object, which is a new form of an airplane. Now, previously, airplanes used to look, as Vitruvius would have it, used to look like airplanes, right? They looked like they were overcoming gravity, and in fact they were. And therefore they took a certain shape. And because airplanes took a certain shape to overcome gravity, architecture began to take the same kinds of shapes on, because those shapes were supposed to be good, beautiful, and invested with all kinds of moral overtones of the latest way to overcome gravity. Now what we have is another kind of need for this airplane, because we no longer have to worry about its shape looking like it can get up in the air. We all know that airplanes get up in the air. We don't get sick anymore. Now what we have to do is make sure that they stay up in the air. And in order to stay up in the air, it has to deal with electronic means, that is radar, and electronic interception. What the scientists have worked out is that, in fact, if we produce a folded form and a folded shape, it makes the image of something dispersed, and so therefore the radar does not form an image of this as an aeroplane. And hence the form of this has to do with maintaining its condition, its aerodynamic stability against the electronic media. And so we get this folded form. Now one can argue, as I do in my work about folding, that the difference, as Vauquelin does in his very famous book, The Renaissance and the Baroque, the Renaissance was about articulation, the Baroque was about obfuscation, the Renaissance was about the Baroque about blurring. And in fact, if you go to Leibniz is the first one that says that folded forms are the way to, in a sense, overcome the logoism of the articulated rational condition of the Renaissance discourse. And so what I'm interested in is this transmutation, this reframing of the discourse of articulation into a discourse of folding and blurring, the overcoming, the excessive possibility of the fold to overcome the logocentric grid. And you're going to see the fold used in many different ways, but again, coming out of this kind of imagery. Next, please. This is a project in Edogawa in Tokyo. It's important because this is a totally mediated project. It started, and I, with all apologies to my Japanese friends who are here, when I went to first meet the client, I spoke, and still spoke, and speak no Japanese. I had an interpreter. We had a very formal meeting, which is the case with most Japanese meetings, and when we got done, I said to my interpreter, you know, even though we've signed a contract, we've shaken hands, we want to do this building, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And so my interpreter asked the president of the company what I was supposed to do, and he, in his best English, said, "Cover." And I said, "Cover." He really means shelter, and doesn't know the difference between cover and shelter. And I said, you know, could you tell Mr. So-and-so that I know that I'm supposed to create a shelter. What else am I supposed to do? Now, if you know Japanese in any sense and form, the dignity and pride of the occasion is very important. You are not supposed to question somebody, but we tried. I think that's what my interpreter did. And again, he got back, but this time very, very harshly, "Cover." And I was, again, perplexed, and I said, "Look, we're not going to get very far like this. Would you ask him to elaborate?" And he then blasted into Japanese, 7 or 8 sentences, very quickly, agitated, clearly something was wrong. And so I said, well, what did he say? Well, in essence, Peter, what he said was, he said, I don't give a damn what goes inside the building as long as it gets on a magazine cover. This is the first building of mine that's made the AP Newswire. You don't know what it's like to be on the you really know you're making it with middle world, right? Not only middle America, but middle world when you get on the AP Newswire. I mean, I got this building's pictures sent back from Charleston, South Carolina, from Buenos Aires, from Tel Aviv, all over the place. People were saying, look, we saw your building. You know, and then, of course, there it was, and you know, in all its glory. It made the cover of 70 Japanese publications. It was, in my client's terms, successful. I don't want to say anything about it more than that. Can I have the next two slides, please? Next two. Next two. Next two. Next two. Some people jokingly call this a weak erection. Next two. I mean, with all apologies to Zaha, for me, it got a little out of hand. Zaha's influence on me. She won't recognize it probably, but other people have commented on it. Next, please. The whole staff of this workforce had to be retrained to use this space. Next, please. Now, clearly, we are in a state of crisis when an architect has to go to these lengths to build a building. Next. 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 The terrible thing about this project is we built a model of it, and the Japanese are so good at copying things that this building is an exact replica of the model. And of course, why I say terrible is that buildings are supposed to have an affective condition, that is something that you couldn't have predicted from the model. And what's for me, what's lost in this building is that there's nothing different between the building and the model. I mean, if you were a Lilliputian, you could have experienced this in the model in my office. And I think, therefore, I'm not convinced that it's an affective building. I believe it's that difference that creates singularity as well. The difference that there is something between the model and the object of fact, of reality, that causes reality to come into existence, rather than having already been in existence in the tape, as it were, of the building, in the computer, and therefore the manifestation of it is merely a secondary condition. Next, please. This is the Columbus Convention Center. It's only 3 miles down the road from the Wexner Center, yet it's miles and light years away from it in terms of its being. I call it a contextual building because it takes the Baudrillardian notion of the American highway system as this complex of curved forms, and instead of seeing them as framing devices, uses the curved form as the object itself. It was an attempt to take from these linear buildings, which is part of the pattern of late 19th century Columbus, and extending them through the building as a mediating device through to the highway system. It's an attempt. The convention center is the new town hall. It is the new symbolic presence This is the first building. You see that road goes directly to the airport. You come in from the airport and you hit this building. It is the new town hall, the library, the town square. It is the place where symbolically one encounters commerce of the city. We wanted to do this. These buildings are usually very monolithic, very unscaled, unstructured in any kind of way. This is a 600,000 square foot building, an enormous scale. There are 3 football pitches fit inside this thing stacked up. The ballroom is a capacity of 5,000 people. And to try and make an urban monument, and think of an urban monument that is not phallocentric, non-hierarchical, and non-logocentric, was what was in our minds, and this is what came out of it. You can choose what you want. It's an incredible experience from its 5th facade, the air, as you come in over Columbus to see this object. Next, please. That was the building in its model form, and of course it will also have these lasers as part of the electronic show of this. What's interesting is that the first convention that is coming to Columbus are 20,000 Southern Baptists. And when asked why they were coming, it's because they saw this model as something to do with an analog to their religious feeling. This is not quite what I had in mind, but you see, you can read when you start getting into the public psyche, you can be read in very many different ways. Next, please. There's a better slide of the way these things take you into the throughway system in the project. Next, please. The slide on the right shows you the difference between phallocentrism and this building. Those were the other symbolic buildings, the gray presence of Columbus, Ohio, next to this particular object. I have no idea, good or bad, but it's certainly something that causes people to react. As I said, this was the Vertigo building. Next two, please. This is a project that we're in the process of working on in Frankfurt, Germany. It's an urban planning project that we won in a competition for a site very next to the Frankfurt Fair. And we used, again, one of the discourses of aggregation and folding is the discourse of René Thom's catastrophe theory. And this is one of the catastrophe curves. This is the butterfly curve. And all we did was to take this thing and divide it into an architectonic matrix, that is, to cut it into sections so that we could then use it as an analog for deploying an architectural structure. Next, please. And we took a traditional grid on the left, and we put it through this, as it were, it's like cheese slicer of these sections of the catastrophe net, and that's what happened on the ground plan on the right. Next, please. And this is when, on the left, a much more three-dimensional evocation of that net. And then we took the tradition of Siedlung buildings and perimeter blocks, which are the tradition of German building, and especially in Frankfurt, and we took that as a base because we were doing housing and office structures, put it through the net, and this is the kind of, in the upper right corner, the kind of structures you begin to get. Next, please. And you can see what happens when you take a dumb gridiron form and start to pass this folded net through it. Next, please. There's a three-dimensional Cartesian building volume on the right-hand slide on the left, and the drawing right next to it, and the model on the left shows you what happens when the net folds through and you actually fold a building. This was the first kinds of studies that we did, is to find out what a folded building would look like. Next, please. And there is a folded office block. Next. And there's a folded perimeter block, and then 4 blocks together. Next. And then more, elongated series of these blocks as taking through the whole of one of the lines of the catastrophe net. Next, please. And you can see then we put down the volume as it would be in a traditional German zoning envelope of what was needed in terms of offices and housing on the right, and then what it would look like on the left through the net. Next, please. Now, the idea of the competition was not to change Frankfurt and say there was the past and the future, but to reframe the environment, so that what this does is here is an existing Siedlung here, and over here and over here, and our addition merely reframes the total. It doesn't say that the past is wrong. It merely says we now are going to look at the past differently by the juxtaposition of the two. We're not making a tabula rasa and starting over again. We're saying we're just looking at it, in other words, shifting the focus of the object. Next, please. There is the model and the drawing of the project. What's interesting about it is that the bureaucrats in Frankfurt, or the city government, are absolutely, they won't let us move a muscle to change this thing. They're stuck with this catastrophe net. They love the idea of this intellectual basis of their work. We got the reds, the greens, and the blacks to agree in Frankfurt on something where they never agree on anything. They all voted overwhelmingly to get this project to go ahead. And now what we're having to do is to design what is called the Bebauungsplan, which is the zoning plan for this. And of course, zoning doesn't account for any kind of three-dimensional Z-dimension shifts. Zonings are basically XY coordinates, and by XY coordinates, you can't describe this building because all the things that happen to this building are in the Z dimension. And so what we're having to do is to redesign Frankfurt zoning. And we are producing a codex for developers on this site. And the city's insisting, and even paying us money, that we develop this codex. And of course, this is the difficult thing. Now, what is it that we would want to happen? In other words, if we were doing these buildings, and in fact, we're starting with 600,000 square foot of this building in 2 or 3 weeks, starting to work on the design of this building, and we don't know what we want it to be. Not only we don't know what this should be, but what is all the rest of this stuff. Because there's one thing is to do a competition, an ideogram. The other thing is, what the hell do you build? And of course, this is a big difference than theory. This is now a practice that people have to work in it, live in it. How do you live and work in a folded environment? We're really struggling right now to find out what that means. And I don't know the answer. I mean, in other words, we've got hundreds of these folded models, and somebody says, Peter, why don't you choose? And of course, I don't know what it means to choose. I have no sense of what the rules of choice are, even, I mean, because it's not sort of a question of style. It's not stylisms. It's not aestheticism. It's not ideology. On what basis is one choosing? And it's certainly not function or maintainability or cost. What we're trying to do is find out some median line that we can weave between these that really obeys the discourse. And since the discourse is, a folded city plan is so very new, what means to obey our own discourse. What are the codex that we would write to obey this structure? It's a very interesting problem because there is no written material on how to do this. Next, please. The plans, and of course we've gone beyond these things. There's a catalog on this, 2 catalogs that have been put out on this project that with some very interesting essays about the philosophic implications of folding in an urban context, which I think, may or may not be available in the AA bookstore, but certainly they can be gotten. Next, the whole project. What is so interesting and frightening is I've always wanted to do something. I really am not interested any longer in this individual building phenomenon and the idea of thinking of doing a seedling or part of the city where you can actually do an environment is a very interesting challenge. As I was saying to Alan Balfour before the lecture, what you really find out is that the software on computers for doing this thing is compositional. And what compositional means that it doesn't aggregate, that is, it doesn't take up the contingent void spaces between buildings. You are putting things down, even in the computer. The guys designing the software are Sun people. They're not understanding what it means to aggregate. And there is no aggregative software available. And so we're just now beginning to realize that we're going to have to move into the design of our own software if we're going to really move into this other discursive mode. Next, please. Pictures of the model. Next. 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 This is a project. This is the art center, this performing arts center in Emory, in Atlanta, Georgia. It's a building that is going to be one of the 2 venues for the Cultural Olympics in 1996. It's a series of 4 theaters, a music theater, a dance theater, a stage theater, and a film theater, all of them sitting over an existing garage. I'm not going to explain the discourse, but it again is about the overlaying of topographical and geological folds with the folds involved in the musical harmonies, putting them into a computer and, in a sense, almost pressing a button, and producing some very interesting and problematized spaces for listening and viewing. Next, please. The site plan. For the first time, though, what's interesting in my own work is that this has 2 aspects. One, an internal, an external from above, that is composed from without, and this is the compositional structure from without, and then it has an internalized, each of these theaters has an internal structure, this, and this, that are very different from the space of this piece out here, giving you also the contingent in-between space, the so-called lobby space, which also then becomes a different structure than the entire from above, let's say. And so what, for the first time, that I've been aware of is that in the work, instead of an overall encompassing strategy, one is beginning to work on the contingencies of the interior and allowing them to play into and against and blur the totality of the, let's say, the Gesamtkunstwerk attitude that has been dominant, let's say, in my own work in the past. And it wasn't until I began to look at this possibility of aggregation and look at the possibility of working from within that this became possible to do. Next, please. Next. 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 Sections are I think, there's a longitudinal and horizontal sections. The film theater, for me, is one of my favorites because traditionally performance is pitched this way and the audience is pitched this way, whether it's dance or music or stage. And what's interesting is film changed all that and put the site of performance vertically. And what we've done is put the audience now vertically. And we have 4 balconies here, 2 rows deep, no orchestra at all, and so that you watch the film from this vertical orientation. So there is this condition of double vertical planes of the audience and the object, the subject and the object, confronting each other like this rather than like this. And I think it's the first time in a film theater that this has been done. I'm really very excited about the film theater. It also has the lobby opens to rear projection from, so that you see the ghosted images, blurred images from the rear of the screen, which is the wall of the lobby from the outside. So there is a lot of things that condition the space differently than the traditional film theater. Next, please. The model of this object. We are starting construction in August. It's been really very interesting how this very conservative institution has moved quickly to allow this to happen, probably against all of their sensibilities, but nevertheless something keeps them going. What's interesting here is Michael Graves' new museum building here, and this is Michael McKinnell's new law school here. Both of them look like they've been there, business school rather, been there forever, which is, you know, one kind of attitude toward the past, make something look like it was there forever. And of course, for me, ours looked like it was always there forever, but from a different forever than their view of forever. But who's to tell? Which view of forever? Is the future forever, or is it the past that's forever? For me, the future is forever, especially when you're dead. It seems like forever. I've been told the future is more forever than the past. Nevertheless, who will know? Next, please. Of course, the people in facilities keep saying, couldn't we just straighten some of those things out? Yeah, you could, I suppose. The president of the university doesn't like to hear my explanation, says that for him it looks like rocks, looks like rock crystal formations coming out of the ground. I tell him that's exactly what it is. It was rock crystals coming out of the ground. So it's whatever you want to call it. Next, please. Next. There's the structure. Clearly, we're having some problems with the structural engineer. That's our idea of the structure. But nobody ever told one that one had to pass structures in university. I think it's useless to even take it. You never could do something like this if you knew what structures were really about. So much for the mechanical paradigm. Next, please. This is a project that we are presently working on in Berlin. This is the Unter den Linden, the famous Unter den Linden, the Brandenburg Gate, the Friedrichstrasse, the main north-south street, the Friedrichstrasse station. This is the Spree River. This is the site of the Mies Tower, this triangle here. This is our site right over here in dark. It's the site of the former Hans Polzig Schauspielhaus, done for Max Reinhardt, and the building we're doing is the new monument to Max Reinhardt House, which which will present the city with 2 theaters, an archive, a foundation, etc., and bring the spirit of Max Reinhardt back to the city in more ways than one. Of course, the city, when you see this building, hates this building, wants nothing to do with it because it breaks all of their rules about having a 22-meter height limit. Of course, one doesn't know why they have a 22-meter height limit, except that the head of city planning says it reminds him of the good old days of Berlin. I have some strange feelings about the good old days. I never understand what he's talking about, especially the pictures that he sends me always have swastikas in them. I wonder what the message is. Maybe those are the best photographs that he could get. But nevertheless, always the ones I get are pictures from the 30s. Maybe that's when they invented photography in Berlin. Who knows? But anyway, that's what he's get to show me what a 22-meter high building looks like. It always seems to look like a swastika. Next. I've been told they're that way because it's when the fire ladders used to be able to go up 22 meters, and that was it. Anyway, when my client came to see me, and this came from a real client, he said, "Peter, I want you to do a building like you've never done before." And he said, "I want it about 120 meters high." And I said, "Well, I've never done a high-rise." He said, "I don't want a high-rise, just do a building." And I said, "Okay, I'm going to see if I can do the first non-phallocentric high-rise building." This is my attempt at this. I call it a bisexual building. And maybe it is and maybe it isn't, but that's for my critics to say. Next, please. It started from the notion of, because I thought, what can be not phallocentric? And the first thing I thought of is something that has no inside and no outside, something that is cave-like and mountain-like at the same time. What is that form? It's a Mobius Bond. What is the Mobius Bond? It comes from August Mobius, the German mathematician. What could be more German than that? And so we stuck it into the computer. The building is totally comes from a computer program. We put the Mobius in. We extended it out into planes, as you can see here. We then connected the planes dot to dot with the volumes and produced the object. Next, please. And then, because we want it to be a little more like Berlin, since Schinkel threw cubes into Baroque Berlin to make it more less Baroque and more neoclassical, we decided to throw cubes into our building to make it, in a sense, more Baroque. And so, like the die that you throw, we just threw these die into the building. They become the theater volumes in the project, and you can see what they're like in the sections. Next, please. Those are the first models we made of the project. It's, you know, it's the Wagner Mimes Cave and Brunhilde's Valhalla at the same time. It's Mann's Magic Mountain and Das Rheingold, all of those kinds of things. It's German Expressionism, which it isn't. It's crystals and the new form of crystal, the quasi-crystal, call them the crazy crystals. It's any number of conditions of meaning all together. Next, please. There's the elevation and the sections. Next. Section from the side. This thing works beautifully. In fact, the plans my developer says are too functional. We'd like them to be a little more like Philip Stark. I mean, the hotel works too well. We'd like something that was a little less workable in this hotel. Next, please. These are the floor plans. I don't know why it says they're so workable, but maybe they are. Well, we didn't try to make them straight. It just turned out this way. Next, please. We have floor plans that, you know, for all 40 floors, worked out in excruciating detail. Next, please. There, the last two pictures. This is This was a rendering done on a real heavy computer, Silicon Graphics alias computer. And even this thing started to break down and fuzz out on us because of the number of calculations it had to make in order to do this. So, you know, it's this stuff is really problematic, and to get renderings like this, it's you know, big time money, and it's clearly something that I could never have drawn or thought of drawing or tried to make a perspective of it. We had really difficult building a model. We never got a model to fit together because we couldn't really conceptualize enough what the hell this thing was to get it into model form. I'm sorry I don't have slides of the models, but I just got the photostats of the model photographs. The model went over just in December, and we're just getting it photographed now. But I'm not convinced the model looks like this, which is interesting. The drawings and the model are very different things. Next, please. This is a project we just did in Dusseldorf. It talks about the new kind of boundaries, no longer the mechanical boundaries that cities are formed by. And we assume, again, that is what the city was about. The origin of Dusseldorf, the wall, the bounding medieval wall, then the exterior fortresses, then and the river. This was our site up here. And then these boundaries move out, and we get the grid and various road systems forming boundaries. Next, please. And then the grid and the extension out into the 19th century City Beautiful movement. Again, our site now becomes an edge with the railroad, the central railroad line, and an autobahn connecting north-south. It's an interchange connecting north-south pieces. And again, talking about the possibility of doing other than these kind of boundaries. Next, please. And so what we did was to say there are other boundaries that exist in Dusseldorf today, because our site is in the flight path, and so that it's in the radar path, and they're bounded. There is a fifth dimension, and that dimension is the interference pattern that's set up by the radio tower from here and the radar tower over here. Produces a moire pattern which gives you a specific, site-specific context for locating a structure. And here is what that looks like in an abstract diagram. We then took one of our other computer programs, a Mathematica program, which creates mathematical algorithms, creates three-dimensional form from mathematical algorithms. Next, please. We took it and produced this kind of diagram out of the AB. This is the what it looks like blown up in the plan, and this is what it's like in 3 dimensions. Next, please. And another view of the Mathematica view of the topological interference pattern. Here's what it looks like in 3 dimensions. Here's what it looks like in plan. We're now getting more and more architectural, to moving it toward 3-dimensional physical elements, which again are down. They are not aggregative elements, but compositional elements, because they only model the solids rather than the voids. Next, please. Here's what the early model of this project looked like. And what's interesting, we began to read this thing, although it's coming from the latest electronic devices, as again a kind of geological strata. And you begin to see geological formations, land, the cracking of an Earth's surface, the melding of landscape and building into one kind of continuous fabric. Next, please. There is the model of the final project and the drawing of the final project. We took last place a firm called Cohn-Pedersen-Fox, which I don't know what is the equivalent of Cohn-Pedersen-Fox in England, but I think they're maybe even here tonight, for all I know. They have an office here. They won, we lost. It's one of my happiest moments in my life that they didn't give us a second prize. It's one of my most interesting projects because it's really talking about another urbanism, again, and another way of putting land and building together. Next, please. The zoning diagrams. Next, please. Close-up landscape and built form. Next, please. There, the buildings. Next, please. Next, please. This is what really killed us in the jury. They saw these perspectives. We had to do perspectives, and they said, uh-oh, would anybody want to raise a child there? Which I said I would, but, you know, that didn't count. Since I might have been the only one that actually did have a little child to raise. What did they know about raising children? I said to them. Next. But they looked at me with their beady eyes and their crew cuts again and said, yeah, Eisenman, why does your project look different than all the other projects? And I thought, huh? And I got that smell again, you know, that I didn't like too much. And, you know, I thought, gee, where have I heard that before? And I said something like, you know, it's really interesting. This child didn't want to look different than everybody else's, but, you know, why don't you ask those other people why theirs look all the same? And I said I thought competitions were about bringing children that look slightly different. Of course, this made them wince. We lost 19-2, but with beady eyes and crew cuts, you know, I don't think you get much more these days. Next, please. We even tried to sort of make them with real people. Holocaust survivors. Next two, please. Happy people with dogs. Next. Next. It was a color scheme maybe that got them too. Next. Sections, plans. We did all these things. Even gave them models of buildings. No use. $90,000 down the drain. Next. Here's a competition we actually took second in. Being second in, this is the Friedrichstrasse Competition. Actually may give us a piece of it to build in Berlin. This is next to our site. They were so happy that we didn't show that other awful building, and they were so relieved. They asked us to come in to do a competition, hoping that maybe we would lose again because we would show this terrible building we'd made here, but we fooled them. We didn't do that. Next, please. We only made some strange distortions. We started with the perimeter block into the Siedlung and into the distortion as it moved through the building, through the site. I won't tell you, I've gone on too long. Next, please. I've never seen these slides. They just also arrived today. But you begin to see some, again, the latest manifestation of folding. Every time it takes on another kind of discourse as it begins to develop and emerge in our thinking. Next, please. This obeyed the 22-meter height limitation. Next. I think that's going to be it. There it is. Can we have the lights, please? I'm really sorry, Alan, that I went over time, but I want to conclude with something that I think is very important. That I truly believe that modernism was not the revolution that it pretended to be. And when I say that I didn't know how to write the zoning rules for the project in Frankfurt, I really think it's very symbolic and symptomatic at the same time of the condition we're in. I do not believe that the book has been written on architecture in the electronic medium and what that means, because we've been in the mechanical era for 500 years. And I truly believe that Corbu didn't know what the electronic media was. I truly believe that the people that written books, Venturi's complexity was nothing to do with the Santa Fe complexity of self-organizing systems. His complexity was something to do with a little tepid remark to the sterilism of modernity. Basically, everything was status quo. And I really think that it's probably this book or these books are not going to be written, or texts more appropriately, are not going to be written by me. But I really think are going to be written by you all. And I think it's an enormous responsibility when you think that Palladio's 4 books of architecture are probably more important to the world than the buildings that he ever did. And they stay with us to this day. There's nothing that can replace the Quattro Libri. And they are still active and alive as anything can be. And what I want to leave you all with as students and young architects is the fact that you have an enormously exciting and wonderful opportunity, because I am, in the end, a cheerleader for architecture, and I believe in a certain way that I have kept a fire alive in the idea that media would like to have extinguished architecture, and in fact largely has. No architects have ever been locked up in jails, as have poets and writers, because nobody really cares about architects and architecture, and they never do anything that's worth locking them up for anyway. Maybe you all will write things that will cause architects to finally become political prisoners. That would be a very interesting thing. But I really think that nothing has been done. And you don't know what to do. Your teachers certainly don't know what to do. And I don't know what to do. But I certainly feel that 50% of you, that is the women in this audience, have the possibility of really starting anew and rewriting a book that no man in this audience is going to be able to write. That is the story of an other architecture, a moon architecture. And I think that would be a big, interesting, enormously vital and appropriate task. I will be of no help in writing such a book. I only applaud the possibility that in our lifetime, and you in this audience, that such a thing may be possible. I truly believe that we are not only facing a time of the third millennium, and thus a condition of enormous psychic and emotional change, an apocalyptic moment, because how many people live through a change in millennium? And if you remember, if you are a millenarian and all in any of your discourse, you will remember the kind of upheavals that occurred the last time that we hit a 1,000-year moment. And I think it is truly the same now. And that we are not only in an apocalyptic moment in time and space, but also in architecture. And I leave you with the enormous energy that those kinds of times create, and hope that you all will begin writing the books that will begin to describe that apocalypse. Thank you very much. Comments or questions? I went on long.
In reaction to last night, I keep trying to sort through the sort of political character, the implications of these objects. I mean, clearly the pieces have an interesting relationship, but they don't quite fit. There's this wonderful evocation of a kind of the effect of media on us, and then all the explorations of a kind of gender bias to the formation of new architecture, and then the work. And I keep trying to read back and forward, of course, as one must. And of course, sometimes it fits, and sometimes it doesn't. In a way, my measure increasingly, as I look at the effect of the sort of the media condition, is the whole dilemma of dealing with repression. is the way in which architecture becomes increasingly a constraint, and increasingly a kind of an absolutely misplaced authority. And so looking at your work in these terms, I mean, with all of this sensitivity to media and the gender issues, I wondered, and being arrhetorical isn't enough, I wondered to what degree it actually, how it was dealing with that kind of oppression.
Well, first of all, what I tried to make clear, what I think is, you see in the Columbus Convention Center, which you also are going to see in the Emory project in Atlanta, is the fact that architecture, this what you call the misplaced authority, the fact that people have lost the capacity to deal with real time and real space. In other words, to what's happening in the now, and to have a somatic experience. In other words, they have lost this almost empathetic condition with their physical environment. In other words, they believe since they can use a telefax, a portable laptop, and a cellular telephone, that they don't have to be anywhere. And indeed, drugs like ecstasy and virtual reality are telling them that, in fact, they can conjure up any kind of physical reality that they want. What I was trying to argue for is not a return to the authority of architecture, but to say that architecture has to come to terms in some way with these conditions and find a way to return the physical experience, which we all need. That's where affect, singularity, and aggregation came into the discourse. And I only recently realized, in other words, I abandoned, in a sense, the position that I would have taken 10 years ago, because I have suddenly come to realize that people can no longer deal with space the way they did in the Renaissance. In other words, I was basically doing late Renaissance work, late work of articulation and surface, okay? And I think the new work is very different and tries to suggest that we need to re-establish architecture as an experience, and that people need the physical experience. They need to feel clammy and hot and excited.
Bad sound and all these things you
Yeah,
talked about.
and, you know,
but what you seem to reveal in this is architecture's limitations. It's an extremely crude condition.
oh, what I call very weak media.
So merely making people feel airsick because you slip the walls slightly sideways isn't doing too much. And it certainly is no way a competition to that larger condition of stimulations we have.
But it's beginning. What I'm saying is,
But I mean, it's not clear how much more. I mean,
how much more it can do ever.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not.
And where in this does it come to terms? Where does it integrate that other stuff? Where does it become part of? Where does it become essentially medium? Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that, you know, the idea, that slide I showed with the lasers. In other words, the whole notion of the laser, the idea of architecture as event. We really haven't yet come to terms with how you deal with the rock concert, the rave movement, and how that is integrated into, that is sound, light, color, movement, okay, are essentially what the rave and rock concerts are about. How they become integrated into physical environments so that they're not just pop environment. In other words, how, for example, one of the great challenges to me is the shopping mall. How could you make architecture with all the media that's in the shopping mall, right? With all the thing is that it's an advertising environment, right? How would you make it into architecture? And is architecture necessary in a shopping mall? I think the real issue coalesces around these possibilities, and how do they then become truly urban environments, not Disneylands?
No.
In other words, how, or is Disneyland, you see, I think Disney World is a really interesting thing because it truly is a mediated environment. There is no question that Disney is a media. Now, is this all that architecture can be?
Well, of course, the moral philosopher in me says that, I mean, I'm glad you moved to that, because simply to see architecture captivated by media is to deny it that central authority for maintaining the idea of the public realm. Huh?
That's right.
And how do we make that interface
And what is
in a
the
way that
public
is
realm?
liberating?
Yeah. Is there a possibility in a media world of a public realm? I say yes. Is it necessary? I say yes. You could argue that this is an old-fashioned position. In other words, the formlessness people, the people that say that form is unimportant, that everything is media, right? that everything is content, that we don't have to worry about form anymore, and that the most banal formal environments are fine. Maybe you have to consider their point of view. I mean, I would say that the argument of the 90s is going to maybe hinge on form versus formlessness, or what Jeff calls information versus deformation, could just be one of the major topics.
Yeah, it seems major to us, but when you think of the world population doubling in the next 50 years, when you think of this astonishing liberal kind of revolution that keeps tumbling on in ways in which the mediation allows at least in an infinite number of self-definitions by a whole variety of means. I mean, whether we call it deformation, information is neither here nor there.
Oh, I agree, but what you're saying is, what do we do about that? I mean, well, we're basically saying we're going to reinvent the world again. I mean, Tokyo is about to rebuild the city of Tokyo again.
Well, that's the key issue. I mean, it's not the object, it's the frame of the city. Yeah. How do we frame cities in which all of these things? I mean, the real game for architecture is at that level.
But you see that, how many architects, I'm late in my career, let's say, I'm starting to get into that, you know what I mean, or early in my career, who knows. But I mean, I'm really excited about doing urban projects. But how many times do architects ever get consulted? You know, architects are thought of as stylists, basically. They're thought of as window dressing. You know, they come in and decorate ideas that have already been policy. They don't make policy. In other words, if Bill Clinton, let's say, said, listen, we need a whole new infrastructural idea for American cities. We need to find out how we connect our maybe we build cities around airports. Maybe we build them around termini. You know, maybe there are such things as business cities and living cities. Who knows? Although I think this separation is an awful thing, because the shopping mall has proven that this doesn't work. The thing is, no one asks architects to come in at the level of policy. And not even Philip Johnson has never been brought in. And so what you're saying is we are educating. I go back to your job as a leading educator in the world and say, what are we doing in our schools to make people able to deal with the level of policy where somebody is eventually going to ask one of them to be involved at that level?
Yes, I sense that, I mean, this thing that we have talked about, this creation of the Architectural Association Design Policy Institute, appears to me the vehicle.
Yeah.
And I suppose just conceptually, I suppose if one could do anything, one would love to, in a sense, replicate the events of 1793. For me, and of course, it's not a direct parallel, but I mean, the most brilliant piece of sort of weak form in relation to the city was the Jefferson-Harrison gridding of America.
Yeah, oh.
Astonishing, I mean, a conceptual project of unbelievable scope. Huh?
And they went and surveyed it, by the way, not only...
Oh, yeah, and you see that. You see the drawings of American City sort of gliding that grid across this totally changing landscape, spinning the sea in Santa Barbara. Jesus. Huh?
And what a project.
What a project.
Yeah.
Have we the intelligence to reform that for the 21st century?
Yeah, but nobody's asked the question.
Well, I mean, we're beginning to know.
Yeah, but I mean,
Yeah. Do you have it?
But you see, then we have...
Do you know how to set the problematic?
Do I not? No, I don't. But I mean, if somebody challenged me to, I don't think the problematic... I guess what I would like to say is I formerly thought the problematic was a linguistic one, okay? And my work was geared to the linguistic analysis of the world. I now no longer believe that is where architectural theory has any relevancy at all. Right? In other words, to talk about deep structures and semantic and syntactics, or even to talk about language games and deconstruction. You know, I think what we really need to talk about is what is the problematic, how does one form it for the 21st century, that is, for an other urban infrastructure, and how do we define what that problematic should be. That's where I'm working right now. In other words, I'm starting, when I talk about aggregation, right? I'm saying is, well, maybe if Jefferson is composition, okay? In a way, it's laying something down from outside, okay? How do you do this, right? And what is that? You know, and I think that's an interesting, see. And I think if Charles Jenks, you see, the thing that Jenks wants to do in May, if we could... If you could,
that could be the
if you could key it that way, right? and say, okay, we are dealing with this new idea of aggregation as it applies to all kinds of systems, ecological systems, biological systems, economic systems. What about urban systems? That is the issue. What is the discourse of the new urbanism vis-a-vis the idea of complexity in self-organizing systems? That to me is the issue, and if we could do that at a conference, that would be stunning. It would be a real breakthrough.
I think that's a terrific prospect. Thank you.
Good.